Hello and welcome once again to all of my brilliant students. Today we're going to be going over Unit 1, Lesson number 9, over character traits and a few types of characters, okay? So we're going to learn about character traits and how often an author, or how an author uses characterization to reveal them. We're going to learn the different types of characters and how authors use them in short stories, and we're going to understand stereotypes and the implicit biases and how to recognize them within ourselves. So, first off, let's go ahead and let's review really quickly and remember that we can always learn about a character in the following ways: through direct characterization and indirect characterization. Now, direct characterization, remember, doesn't require any sleuthing or detective work. Indirect characterization, you have to pick apart a little bit more, right? You have to look at the appearance and the actions and the words, thoughts, and feelings and relationships of a character. But what does it tell us? The answer is character traits. A character trait describes the behavior or attitude of a person, and they could be used to describe anyone. You yourself have character traits. I myself have character traits. They are traits that describe my character. And so authors also have character traits for all of their characters because they are writing about people. They are writing about persons. So, for example, a character can be outspoken or they can be shy. They can be persevering or temperamental. They can be any number of different things. Any way that you can think of describing a human's attitude or their behavior is a character trait. The important thing to remember is that character traits don't describe a character's physical appearance, okay? It has to describe behavior and attitude. So if your character has dark hair, that's not a character trait. That is just a part of their appearance, and that might reveal something about a character trait. It might not. Okay, if the character had like pristine, clean, straight black hair, maybe that tells you that they're cleanly, right? Maybe it tells you that they care about their appearance, but the black hair itself is not a character trait, okay? So, as you've worked on our short story unit, you can probably think of some of the characters and the traits that they possess. As we've read in everyday use, Mama is proud of her work ethic, okay? Thank you, ma'am, Robert is ashamed of himself for stealing. Okay? Tom Beneke in Contents of a Dead Man's Pocket starts off as a very focused businessman, and then those character traits can actually change, right? Stefano is conflicted about his purpose in life. And so you see that it's describing all of their behaviors, and it's describing a little bit about their motivations, and it describes a little bit about their attitudes, right? So all of these all of these are character traits, and characters oftentimes have a lot of them. Okay, so I want to move on and I want to tell you guys about the different types of characters now. So if you have your vocabulary, now would be a good time to get it out, and now would be a good time to begin writing down the definitions, because yes, you can find it in the literature book. You can find a literature definition of it online, but I also have many of the definitions right here for you. So now that we know about character traits and how an author uses characterization to reveal these to the reader, what types of characters are there is the question. Well, first, and this is a pretty simple one that you probably know, is major and minor. Major characters or central characters are vital to the development and resolution of the conflict. In other words, the plot and the resolution of conflict revolves around these characters. And remember, it's all about what? Conflict. A story must have, no matter what, 100% of the time, conflict. And so the characters that are driving that forward, the ones who are primarily focused around that conflict, those are your protagonists, okay? If you can find the main conflict, you can find your major characters, okay? Now, that's not to say that there aren't sometimes minor conflicts, right? But those minor conflicts don't necessarily mean that that is the main conflict, right? The main conflict is the one that is resolved at the end of the story. It's the one that brings us to the climax, and it's the one that the protagonist, the major characters, center around. Minor characters serve to complement the major characters, and they do help move the plots forward. Okay, but oftentimes that is more as a device, as a literary device to move the plot forward. Okay, so for example, Luke Skywalker goes to Obi-Wan Kenobi to learn the ways of the Force. Obi-Wan Kenobi's role is not to resolve any conflict. In fact, he ends up, the conflict that gets resolved is, like, basically him becoming, like, one with the Force, right? Yeah, he's not there to resolve the conflict. He's there to move Luke Skywalker forward in his journey, right? And so that's the difference between a major and a minor character. Now, examining these characters, which are major and which are minor. As I'm looking across over here, I'm seeing several characters, and I see that really, whenever I think about it, all of them do kind of help to propel the plot forward. You have Bruce here, you have Nigel, who actually helps Marlin to find his son Nemo, and then you have Nemo and Dory. However, whenever it comes to the conflict itself, Nigel appears, and then he plays his part, and then he is not so much a part of the movie before or after, right? Same with Bruce. He plays his part, and then he's not as much a part of the movie. Now, we do get to see them at the end, and we get to see everyone happy because it's one of those happy sort of films, but that doesn't mean that the conflict revolves around them. They are only helping the main characters move the conflict forward. And the main characters, of course, are Nemo, our title character, and Dory down here, right? So we have Nemo and Dory, who are major characters, Bruce and Nigel, who are minor. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is dynamic characters and static characters. And dynamic characters, like, I want you to think of the word dynamite or dynamo, okay? It's actually from a Greek word called dunamis. And so really, whenever it comes to dynamic or moving, it means power. It means the actual, like, exertion of power or the exertion of movement. We have the Greeks to thank for that, and we have the Greeks to thank for all of this. And so dynamic characters are characters that undergo an important change due to the action of the plot. Often this change is a result of resolving a central conflict or facing a major crisis. Most dynamic characters tend to be major rather than minor characters because resolving the conflict is the major role of the major characters, right? And so if you have a major character that goes through some sort of transition in their character traits, then they're a dynamic character. Static characters are characters who do not change over time, and their personality does not transform or evolve. Now, it might allude to a past that they might have had. They might look back on a time whenever they were different, but in the story itself, they do not change. And so, therefore, the audience's knowledge of the character does not grow. So whenever we think back on some of the characters that we've actually read about, who is dynamic and who is static? We have, for example, Mrs. Jones, and we have Roger in Thank You, Ma'am, right? Now, Roger goes through a change, doesn't he? Roger, at first, is trying to steal from Mrs. Jones. He tries to steal her purse. She takes him into her house, and then all of a sudden, it's an onus on him not to get blue suede shoes, but for him to be trustworthy. You see character traits that change in Roger. You see his attitude change, right? Mrs. Jones, on the other hand, although we might know that she can empathize with him and that she might have been in a similar place in her past, throughout the story, does she really change? No, she doesn't. We don't really learn a whole lot more about her attitude, or at least the more that we learn about her attitude, the less it actually changes, right? Tom Beneke in Contents of a Dead Man's Pockets. He undergoes a radical transformation from the very beginning, whenever he was entirely motivated by work, until the very end, whenever he begins to re-examine his priorities, right? Dee, in Everyday Use, on the other hand, does not end up changing a whole lot, right? Now, although we might learn more about Dee, Dee's attitude, her behavior, and her opinions never change. Mama and Maggie, on the other hand, do change. Dee ends up leaving in a huff. Dee is the one who is static, all right? Even if she's a major, or even if she's a minor character, or not a minor character, but even if she's a major character, even if she's a protagonist or an antagonist, that doesn't mean that she changes necessarily. So you can actually have some really compelling, cool, static characters, right? Some of the coolest archetypes are oftentimes static characters. Like the ruler is oftentimes a static character, or the sage or the mentor is oftentimes a static character, right? Yoda, throughout the series in Star Wars, like the episode 6, 7, and 8, doesn't really change a whole lot. He's always like this cool, sagacious mentor type character, right? But that doesn't mean that he's boring or uninteresting, okay? It just means that his attitude and behavior doesn't change. Now, I want to go ahead and I want to talk about this really quickly. A foil is any character, oftentimes an antagonist or a supporting character, whose personal qualities contrast with another character. So they're contrasting one another. Just like colors can contrast, characters can contrast, right? You know that the contrasting color of red is green, the contrasting color of blue is orange, and so on, right? And whenever you put those two colors next to one another, it actually makes those colors appear more vibrant, and it actually makes them more distinctive, right? Well, the same thing with contrasting or foiling characters, okay? Some examples that I can think of are Dee and Maggie in everyday use. Dee, who is educated, outspoken, and very confident, whereas Maggie, who is very shy, she is fairly simple and who is not outspoken at all, right? Then you have Dory and Marlin. Marlin, who is very stressed and anxious. Dory, who is carefree. Those qualities sitting next to each other actually enhance the character attributes of both of them, right? It's almost like Mr. Beck is like an objectively short leprechaun of a man, right? And so if you just saw him walking down the sidewalk, you'd go, that's a short dude, right? But if you put if you put someone next to me who is really, really tall, right? If you put like someone next to me who is like 6'6", if you put Steven Adams next to me, like you could say the same thing about Steven Adams if he's walking down the sidewalk, right? You would be like, objectively, that is a tall dude, right? But if Mr. Beck and Steven Adams are hanging out with one another, right? I'm going to make him look even taller, and he's going to make me look even shorter, right? And that's just how foils kind of work, right? One thing I'd like to go ahead and do is I'd like to ask you, how does Rocket and Groot foil one another in Guardians of the Galaxy?
If we're going to get out of here, we're going to need to get into that watchtower. And to do that, I'm going to need a few things. The guards wear security bands to control their ins and outs. I need one.
Leave it to me.
That dude there. I need his prosthetic leg. His leg? Yeah. God knows I don't need the rest of him. Look at him, he's useless.
All right.
And finally, on the wall back there is a black panel. Blinky yellow light. You see it?
Yeah?
There's a Quarnix battery behind it. Purplish box, green wires. To get into that watchtower, I definitely need it.
How are we supposed to do that?
Well, supposedly these bald bodies find you attractive, so maybe you can work out some sort of trade.
You must be joking.
No, I've really heard they find you attractive.
Look, it's 20 feet up in the air, and it's in the middle of the most heavily guarded part of the prison. It's impossible to get up there without being seen.
I got one plan, and that plan requires a frickin' Quarnix battery, so figure it out! Can I get back to it? Thanks. Now, this is important. Once the battery is removed, everything is gonna slam into emergency mode. Once we have it, we gotta move quickly. So you definitely need to get that last. Or we can just get it first and improvise.
I'll get the armband.
Leg. Oh, yeah.
I think that is a wonderful scene for Rocket and Groot foiling one another. You can tell that Rocket, although he is smaller than any of the other characters because he's like a science experiment that has gone horribly wrong or right, depending on how you look at it, over on this raccoon, and he's like this highly intelligent, highly like almost like scheming, planning sort of individual who has a very jaded, dark view of the world, right? Whereas Groot, not nearly as intelligent necessarily, a lot more simple, and Groot's view of the world is not nearly as dark and sinister as Rocket Raccoon's, is it? And yet, here, whenever you put them into a situation, you see their character attributes colliding and creating conflict in the prison scene for one another, and so you see that they are foiling. Right? You see that they're contrasting in this. Rocket, who is planning and scheming. Groot, who is simple and perhaps a little bit naive, who just says, well, if you need that battery, I'll go and grab that battery. Here you go, buddy. Whoops-a-doodle. I guess we've got a fight on our hands, right? So, The last thing I want to talk to you about are flat and round characters. And a round character is anyone who has a complex personality. He or she is often portrayed as conflicted, they're often portrayed as contradictory, but the most important thing about a round character is that they have lots of character traits. Well, you know, whenever I've said it in class, that character is really textured. You have a very textured character. That's what I mean. The character has dimension to them. The character has multiple dimensions, is not just a flat cardboard cutout that you can put up on a stage or into a book and say, well, okay, they're just there and anything can fill in for that. No, it's like it makes them irreplaceable, it makes them interesting, it makes them compelling. So whenever you write your characters, you want them to be round as often as possible, okay? You want to be able to densely pack as much information about that character as you possibly can so that your audience will be able to empathize with that character, or at the very least, understand that character. A flat character, on the other hand, only embodies one or two character traits that are easily recognized. So they can be archetypal oftentimes, but they can also fall into the temptation of being stereotypical. Now, those are two different things. A flat character is not always a stereotype, right? Because you can have a flat character that has one or two character traits. For example, I think of I can think of like a couple of sage type characters, perhaps Yoda again, or I can think of a couple of innocent characters like those archetypes, perhaps Squirt. All right, from Finding Nemo. Squirt from Finding Nemo is just like this cute little turtle, okay? And he kind of embodies the archetype of just an innocent, fun-loving kid, right? Not a stereotype. That's just kind of an archetype that is there. He only has one or two qualities. He could be replaced by another innocent type of character who is like childlike and naive in nature, right? But he's not necessarily a stereotype. The same thing with Yoda, for example. He is like this very wise, very sagacious guy, but he's also extremely eccentric, okay? But you don't get a whole lot beyond that, at least in episode 7. Okay, whenever Luke goes off to Dagobah and he has to train fully to become a Jedi, right? Now, the thing about archetypes and stereotypes is that stereotypes are oftentimes very harmful. And I want to talk to you a little bit about stereotypes. A stereotype is an exaggerated belief, image, or a distorted truth about a group or a person. So this is oftentimes a broad, generalized brushstroke that allows for very little or no individual differences or social variation. Stereotypes are based on images in mass media, reputations passed on by parents, peers, or other members of society, and stereotypes can be positive or negative, but they can always be harmful. And you might be asking yourself, well, hang on a second, Mr. Beck, how can a stereotype, if it's positive, be harmful? The reason why a stereotype is always harmful, regardless of whether it's negative or positive, is it distorts the way that we view people. If you begin to tie certain things to abilities, attitudes, and behaviors, for example, skin color or religion or sexual orientation or mental illness, if you begin to tie those things to abilities and things like that, then you're falling into the stereotype trap. Because what that's saying is the group of people have this in common. They have this ability, they have these attributes, they have these behaviors, and therefore they have these attitudes, right? And so it distorts that. And even if it's positive, oftentimes those are coupled by negative ones. So you might have a stereotype to where it's like, hey, well, this group of people are really good at this, but they're not any good at this. And what that does is it doesn't see the individual person as a whole person. Right? It doesn't necessarily acknowledge, nor does it respect their full identity. Okay? So, stereotypes, are found in racist or insensitive jokes, and they are predicated on the linking of ability or qualities to an entire group of people. So, it's important to understand that stereotypes are actually rooted in implicit bias, and implicit bias is something that everyone has. Okay, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you grew up, who raised you, who your parents were, who your grandparents were. Like, everyone has implicit bias, and therefore it is everyone's responsibility to examine their own. So the difficult thing about this is that implicit bias, that place where the stereotypes come from, is unconscious. Okay, we don't consciously go and we don't consciously stereotype people oftentimes. Okay, like people are becoming more and more aware, and you students, Generation Z students, are becoming more and more open-minded, and they're also becoming more and more aware that stereotypes just don't really work, right? Like, blatant and obvious racism and bigotry is more and more becoming like a mainstream concern, because it's always been and should have been a mainstream problem, right? And that's a good thing that we're addressing that. But the thing about implicit biases is that those things are not necessarily on the surface. Okay, those things are not necessarily something that is exaggerated or easily identifiable. And so the thing is you have to examine it yourself. You have to examine it through your own self-examination, your own recognition, and your own education on the matter on how to dismantle these. Okay, I'll give you a few examples. Some stereotypes can include things that center around race or the color of the skin, right? Or like basically just like how much melanin you have in your skin. And so you can think of any number of different any number of races, from Caucasian white, African American black. You can go to Hispanic and Latino or Latinx. You can go to any number of different Asian stereotypes, right? You can go to, you can even go down, I have here at the bottom, but I'm going to skip down, but it's like you can go to country of origin and say, okay, well, this is how Japanese people behave, Chinese people behave, German people behave, South African people behave, Congolese people behave, and so on and so forth and so on, right? Canadians, Mexicans, Colombians, Brazilians, Chileans, any number of these different people, right? Like, those can include those stereotypes. It can also include religion, right? The Hebraic religion. It can include Jewish religion. It can include Buddhist religion. The Muslim religion, I think, has a lot of stereotypes attached over here in the West. It can also include things like gender, whether that be the binary genders of male and female, or all of the different variations of in between that, right? It can include sex, whether like you have like male parts or girl parts, like that is somehow tied to ability, attitudes, or beliefs. Sexual orientation, mental illness, physical illness, all of these things can have stereotypes attached to it, okay? And it's up to you to be able to identify what are the stereotypes or what are the implicit biases that I might have against any given group of people. The hope is this, is that if hate can be learned, okay, if bigotry can be learned, and if ignorance is willful, like you have to try to be ignorant, okay, then you can unlearn all of those things. It's through learning and education, and it starts with you, okay? So, as we review, major and minor characters, right? Foils, dynamic, static, flat, and round. All of them. Write them. Write all of them, but avoid the stereotypes. Do not be the student who falls into that trap, okay? And the thing that is going to prevent you from doing that is whenever you begin to examine your own heart, your own mind, and what your own unconscious bias might tell you. And that is how you grow. It's actually a really beautiful thing, because we're all in this world together, in this state, not of static, whenever you think about it. You, as a person, are you a static character? Probably not. You're probably really, really dynamic, aren't you? And so think of that and own it. Own that dynamism and own the fact that, hey, you know what? I can change my mind. Or, hey, you know what? I can acknowledge these things. Or, hey, you know what? I can change these things. It's one of the most important things that I could ever teach you. And I'm so glad that I have the privilege to do so. Go out into the world and be great, my brilliant students. Do not stop learning.